There is a woman whose name history has tried to erase for almost 2,000 years. Not once, not twice, but systematically, patiently, generation after generation, council after council, sermon after sermon. A woman who, according to the oldest Gospels, was the first to see the empty tomb, the first to hear the voice of the resurrected, the first to be sent as a messenger of the greatest news the Western world has ever known. And yet, you grew up hearing only one thing about her, that she was a repentant prostitute. Stop for a moment, breathe, and think. Because none, absolutely none, of the 4 canonical Gospels says this about her. Not a line, not a word. This accusation that has crossed centuries, that has been painted in frescoes, carved in marble, shouted from pulpits and whispered in confessionals, was born from the mouth of a single man in a single sermon in the year 591, when Pope Gregory I decided, without any scriptural basis, to merge 3 different women into one figure. And this figure conveniently was silenced, transformed into a symbol of sin, reduced to a shadow at the feet of Christ, when perhaps, and this is the vertigo from which you will not be able to recover in the next few minutes, she was something much, much greater. My name does not matter. What matters is what you are about to discover. Because more than 3 centuries ago, in a small house with fogged glass in Amsterdam, a man named Baruch Spinoza, excommunicated by his own Jewish community, hunted by Christian theologians, watched by Vatican spies, dared to ask a question that no one before him had had the courage to formulate with such coldness, such precision, such geometric lucidity. He asked, what if the sacred texts, as they have come down to us, are not the word of God but the word of men who wanted to govern in the name of God? What if the biblical history we learned is not the history that really happened, but the history that someone at some point decided we should remember? Spinoza was the first modern philosopher to read the Bible as a human would read any other book, with open eyes, with reason lit, with a heart unafraid. And when he did this, he discovered something frightening. He discovered that the Bible that reached us had passed through so many hands, so many cuts, so many translations, so many political and institutional interests, that it was almost impossible to know what was really said, what really happened, and above all, who was really silenced in the process. And among all the silences, perhaps none is more deafening than the silence surrounding her. Mary Magdalene, the woman who walked alongside the Master, the woman who, according to Gospels discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945, Gospels that had been hidden for more than 1,600 years, was called the Companion. The woman who, in an ancient text known as the Gospel of Mary, confronted Peter, taught the apostles and transmitted revelations that no other disciple had received. The woman whose name was erased from official lists, whose role was reduced, whose voice was silenced, and whose true story may have been the greatest victim of what Spinoza would later call, centuries later, the theological machine of fear. Now, I need to ask you a serious question before we continue, and I want you to answer honestly, even if it's just to yourself, in silence there where you are, perhaps lying in bed, perhaps on the bus, perhaps walking down the street with your headphones on. The question is this: what would you do if you discovered that what you were taught since childhood, what you never questioned, what was said by people you loved and trusted, was not exactly true, that there was something more, that there was someone more, that there was a voice, feminine, powerful, wise, that was deliberately muffled so that other voices could occupy the center of history? Would you be angry? Would you be sad? Or would you be curious? Because if you would be curious, then you are in the right place. You are the kind that Spinoza would call a free spirit, someone who is not afraid to look the truth in the eye, even when the truth is uncomfortable. And in the next chapters of this journey, I will take you down paths that few have dared to tread. We will descend into the catacombs where the first Christians hid. We will enter the library of Alexandria before the fire. We will sit by the Sea of Galilee and try to hear, beneath the layers of rewriting, the original voice of a woman named Miriam of Magdala, and we will do this hand in hand with a Dutch philosopher who nearly 4 centuries ago was expelled from the synagogue and burned in effigy. because he dared to think. But I warn you right now, this story is not comfortable. It will stir things that you may have kept in a drawer of your soul, locked with 7 keys. It will force you to reconsider not only what you know about a woman who lived 2,000 years ago, but also what you know about power, about memory, about silence, about what an institution is capable of doing to protect its own narrative. And in the end, perhaps, just perhaps, it will make you reconsider what you know about yourself, about your own faith, about the voices that, in your own life, were silenced so that others could be heard. Take a deep breath, because from now on we will not look back. I want you to imagine a scene. It is the year 33 approximately. The sun is setting over Jerusalem. A woman is walking quickly through the narrow streets of the old city, covering her head with a rough linen shawl. She has just seen something that no other human being has seen before her, and she knows, she feels, with every fiber of her being, that what she has seen will change the world. But she also knows that when she reaches the men who are locked in a room upstairs in a house, when she tells them what she saw, they will not believe her, because she is a woman. And in Jerusalem in the year 33, a woman's testimony had no legal value in a court. And yet, she runs. She runs because she needs to tell. She runs because she was chosen, not by men, but by something greater, to be the first. The first to see, the first to know, the first to speak. This woman is Mary Magdalene, and her run through the streets of Jerusalem is perhaps the most silenced moment in the history of the West. Now imagine another scene. We are in Amsterdam, in the winter of 1656. A 23-year-old young man, thin, with dark, penetrating eyes, walks through the cold streets of the city. He has just been expelled from the synagogue. His former teachers have cursed him with such a terrible curse that the faithful were forbidden to approach him within 4 cubits, to speak to him, to read anything he might write. He does not cry. He does not scream. He simply walks in silence toward the small workshop where he will learn to polish lenses. Lenses that, ironically, will be used by astronomers to observe the skies and discover that the universe is infinitely larger than any theologian ever imagined. This young man is Baruch Spinoza, and what he carries within him on that cold walk is the seed of a thought that, 3.5 centuries later, will still help us understand why a woman like Mary Magdalene had her story stolen, rewritten, buried. Because the connection between them, between a 1st century Jewish woman from Galilee and a 17th century Jew from Amsterdam, is deeper than any timeline. Both were accused, both were excluded, both were transformed into something they were not, for the convenience of institutions that needed to control the narrative. And both, each in their own way, left us clues. Clues scattered like fragments of a broken mirror, patiently waiting for someone to have the courage to piece them together. That someone now is you. Make yourself comfortable. Remove any distractions. Put your phone aside. Because what comes next is not just a story. It is an investigation. It is an excavation. It is a walk through the dark corridors of the collective memory of the West, illuminated only by the small lamp of reason, the same lamp that Spinoza lit on a cold night in Amsterdam, and that no one in 4 centuries has managed to extinguish. Breathe deeply once more, and come with me, because Mary Magdalene is waiting, and she has much, much to say. Amsterdam, July 27th, 1656. The fog still covered the canals when the first rays of sun tried, with little success, to pierce the thick clouds hovering over the city. It was an ordinary day for most of the inhabitants of that prosperous capital of world trade. Merchants opened their shops, fishermen unloaded fish at the docks, women washed clothes on the banks of the canals, children ran barefoot through the narrow alleys. But inside a discreet synagogue in the Jewish quarter, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would echo for centuries, something that none of the rabbis present that morning could imagine would still be discussed, studied, debated almost 4 centuries later. The gates of the Talmud Torah were closed. Inside, in the center of the main hall, the elders of the Jewish community of Amsterdam gathered. They were careful, wise, prudent men who had fled the fires of the Inquisition in Portugal and Spain, who had crossed the ocean to find refuge in the tolerant lands of the Netherlands, who had rebuilt their lives and families from scratch. They knew the price of religious freedom. And they also knew how fragile that freedom was. It only took one scandal, one accusation, one wayward philosopher saying things he should not say, for the entire community to be put at risk. And that was exactly why they were there. The name to be pronounced that morning was Baruch Spinoza, 23 years old, son of Miguel de Spinoza, a respected merchant, recently deceased, a brilliant student of the religious schools in the neighborhood, knowledgeable in Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, a young man who, according to his former teachers, promised to be one of the great rabbis of his generation, but who, in recent months, had been seen in the company of heretical Christians, reading forbidden books, asking questions that no good Jew should ask, questions about the authorship of the Torah, questions about the nature of God, questions about the immortality of the soul, questions that, if answered with the coldness of reason, threatened to topple the entire theological edifice upon which the community stood. The text of the herem, the curse of excommunication, was read aloud. The words resonated through the stone walls, ancient as Judaism itself. Cursed be he by day, cursed be he by night, cursed when he rises, cursed when he lies down, cursed when he enters, cursed when he leaves. May the Lord not forgive him. May the Lord's wrath burn against this man. May all the curses written in this book of laws fall upon him. No one should speak to him, neither in writing nor orally. No one should do him any favor. No one should remain under the same roof as him. No one should approach him within 4 cubits. No one should read any document dictated or written by him. It was possibly the most severe curse ever pronounced by the Jewish community of Amsterdam against one of its own sons. And where was Spinoza while his life was officially being torn apart by the men he had once called masters? He was not in the synagogue. He was not listening. He was, according to reports, in his small workshop, polishing a lens, calm, focused, perhaps even happy, because he had known for a long time that this moment would come, and he had prepared for it with the same serenity with which a geometer prepares to demonstrate a theorem. That young man, expelled from his own community, without living parents, without close siblings, without fortune, without a respectable profession, would turn his life into a solitary walk toward the truth. And this truth, this painful, liberating, dangerous truth, began with a simple intuition, an intuition that centuries later would change the way the West thinks about religion, about politics, about freedom, about the human soul, about God himself. The intuition was this: the sacred texts, as we receive them, are not the direct word of God. They are the word of men, men with interests, men with fears, men with political agendas, men who lived in specific times, in specific cultures, with specific problems. And when we read these texts as if they were dictated by heaven itself, without questioning, without investigating, without comparing, without using the reason that heaven itself gave us, we are making the greatest possible mistake. We are confusing the finger with the moon. We are worshipping the packaging instead of the content. We are ultimately being manipulated. And who manipulates? Those who, throughout the centuries, benefited from the manipulation. The priests, the emperors, the kings, the popes, the councils. Those who decided which books would enter the canon and which would be burned. Those who decided which figures would be venerated and which would be defamed. Those who decided which voices would be preserved and which would be silenced. And among all the silenced voices, Spinoza realized something that few before him had perceived so clearly: the female voices. The voices of women who, in the original texts, had a much larger, much more active, much more prophetic role than the one reserved for them in the official versions. But wait, let's go back a bit, because to understand why Spinoza came to this conclusion, we need to understand where he came from. We need to understand Amsterdam in the 17th century. We need to understand what it was like to be Jewish in that city. We need to understand why that young man, instead of following the comfortable path that was laid out for him, a career in the family business, or perhaps a respectable position as a rabbi, chose the more difficult, more solitary, more dangerous path. Amsterdam in the 17th century was a miracle, a commercial miracle, a political miracle, a cultural miracle. It was the richest city in the world. Its ships crossed all the oceans. Its stock exchanges moved unimaginable fortunes. Its streets were paved with gold from the East Indies, spices from Java, furs from Siberia, sugar from Brazil. And amid all this wealth, one rare thing flourished: tolerance. Religious tolerance, intellectual tolerance, philosophical tolerance. That is why Amsterdam became a refuge for all the persecuted in Europe. French Calvinists fleeing Catholic massacres, English Catholics fleeing Anglican persecutions, German Anabaptists fleeing Lutherans and Catholics, and above all, Jews, Sephardic Jews who had been expelled from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in 1497. Jews who had lived for generations disguised as Christians, forcibly baptized, watched by the Inquisition, burned at the stakes in Lisbon and Seville. Jews who, upon arriving in Amsterdam, could finally, after centuries, practice the religion of their ancestors openly again. The Spinoza family was one of those families. Baruch's ancestors had lived in Portugal, baptized as new Christians, always under the constant suspicion of the inquisitors. At some point in the early 17th century, they had fled to France, then to Holland. In Amsterdam, they could finally return to using their Hebrew names, attend the synagogue, circumcise their sons, celebrate Passover without fear. Baruch's father, Miguel, became a prosperous merchant, importer of dried fruits and nuts from North Africa. His mother, Hannah Deborah, died when Baruch was only 6 years old. And little Baruch, whose name means in Hebrew blessed, was raised among the sacred books of the Jewish tradition and the profane books of the new European science. At that time, there were two intellectual currents vying for the soul of Amsterdam. On one side, traditional rabbinic Judaism, with its veneration for sacred texts, its meticulous laws, its obedience to the ancients. On the other side, the new philosophy being developed by men like René Descartes, who had just died in Stockholm only a few years earlier, leaving behind a revolutionary proposal to use reason, and only reason, as a guide to truth. Not tradition, not authority, not revelation, reason, pure, geometric, unyielding. Spinoza, from a very young age, was seduced by both currents. He loved the Jewish tradition. He loved Hebrew, the sacred language he knew like no one else. He loved the prophets, especially Isaiah with his incandescent poetry. But he also loved reason. He loved the clarity of Greek thinkers, the precision of mathematicians, the courage of modern philosophers who dared to question everything. And at some point in his adolescence, he realized that these two passions, the passion for tradition and the passion for reason, were incompatible, at least in the way they were presented in the synagogue. Because the synagogue taught that the Torah had been dictated by God to Moses, word for word, without any error, without any contradiction, and reason, when applied to the reading of the Torah, showed something very different. It showed contradictions, it showed anachronisms, it showed passages that described the death of Moses himself. How could Moses have written about his own death? It showed names of places and peoples that only existed centuries after the time when Moses supposedly lived. It showed two different versions of the creation story in the book of Genesis. It showed that the God of the beginning of the Bible seemed very different from the God at the end of the Bible. All of this Spinoza saw. And he asked his teachers, and they, instead of answering, told him to be quiet, told him to have faith, told him to trust in tradition. But Spinoza could not, because he had discovered within himself something he could no longer repress, the passion for truth, a passion so strong, so luminous, so non-negotiable that no curse, no excommunication, no threat could extinguish it. And it was this passion that, years later, would lead him to write one of the most dangerous books ever written in the history of the West, a book called Theological Political Treatise, published anonymously in 1670, a book so scandalous that it was immediately banned in almost all of Europe, a book that dared to apply reason to the reading of the Bible, a book that, among many other things, suggested that the sacred history we know may not be in many respects the sacred history that really happened. And it is in this book and in the reading method that Spinoza inaugurates that we will find the tools to ask the most dangerous question of all. And Mary Magdalene. Who was she really? To understand who Mary Magdalene was, even before we get to the texts, before we open the Gospels, Before we discuss the Council of Nicaea or the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, we need to do something that almost no one does. We need to go to the place where she was born. We need to feel, with our feet on the ground, with the sun on our face, with the wind of Galilee in our hair, the world that shaped her. Because contrary to what medieval Christian tradition wanted us to believe, Mary Magdalene was not an abstract figure coming from nowhere, emerging from the void, just to serve as a symbol of feminine sin. Mary Magdalene was a concrete woman, flesh and blood, with a city, with a family, with a profession, with a social position, with a history. Let's go. Magdala. The name itself is already a clue. In Aramaic, the language that Jesus and his disciples spoke daily, Magdala means tower. The city was located on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, roughly halfway between Tiberias to the south and Capernaum to the north. It was a prosperous city. It was not a forgotten village in the middle of nowhere, as many imagine when they hear about the small settlements of Galilee. Magdala was an important commercial center. It had a busy port. It had a specialized industry, the salting and exporting of fish, which was sent throughout the Roman Empire. The Romans, by the way, had a specific name for the city, Tarichaea, which comes from the Greek tarikos, meaning salted fish. Think about that for a moment. The city was so well known for its production of salted fish that the Romans named it based on that trade. This means that Magdala was not a poor city. It was a commercial city with wealthy families, with boat owners, with merchants trading with Jerusalem, with Damascus, with Antioch, with Alexandria, with Rome. It was a city where Aramaic was spoken in homes, Hebrew in the synagogue, Greek in business, and even a bit of Latin when Roman officials passed through to collect taxes. And somewhere in that city, at some point probably between the years 5 and 10 of the Christian era, a girl named Miriam was born. Miriam in Hebrew is the original name. What we know as Mary is just the Greek and Latin version of that name. The same Miriam of Moses and Aaron, the prophetess who led the women in song and dance after crossing the Red Sea. It was a strong name, a name of tradition, a name of women who spoke and were heard. We do not know who her parents were. The canonical Gospels do not say. But recent archaeological excavations in Magdala, conducted since 2009, revealed something extraordinary. A first-century synagogue, perfectly preserved, with a mosaic floor, stone benches, and a mysterious stone carved in the center of the hall, the so-called Magdala stone, with engravings representing the Temple of Jerusalem, including a menorah and symbols that researchers are still trying to decipher. This synagogue, discovered during the construction of a hotel for Catholic pilgrims, is one of the oldest ever found in all of Israel. And it tells us something very important. Magdala was a religiously sophisticated city, a city where Torah was studied, a city where theological debates likely flourished. It was in this environment that Miriam grew up, in a city where women probably had more autonomy than in other regions of Judea. In a city where, with the fish industry being a family business, women often participated in family affairs, managed employees, dealt with money. In a city where the Greek language circulated, exposing people to philosophical ideas from outside, Stoic ideas, Platonic ideas, ideas that valued contemplation, wisdom, the search for truth. But I need to stop here for a moment. I need to speak directly to you, because I know that many of you who are following this story are feeling something strange, something that you may not have known you felt. A kind of discomfort, a kind of awakening, a kind of, how did I never know this before? And this feeling, this discomfort, is exactly what Spinoza, 4 centuries ago, described as the first step to freedom. Before you are free, you need to realize that you were trapped. Before you see the truth, you need to realize that you were deceived. And this realization, my friend, is painful, but it is also the beginning of something wonderful. I need to ask you now, before we continue, what are you feeling at this moment? Curiosity? Indignation? Hope? Perhaps a little bit of all of that. Write it down in the comments. I read each one. Tell me and all the other people who are walking this journey with us what this story is doing inside you. Because I believe with all the sincerity of my heart that stories like this only gain meaning when they are shared, when they cease to be solitary information and become conversation, debate, community. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I make a sincere request. Not for the numbers, not for the algorithm, but because, on the other side of this screen, I am trying to build a space where we can think together, where we can ask questions that are not asked elsewhere, where we can rediscover voices that have been silenced, stories that have been erased, truths that have been locked away in Vatican archives and whispers of forgotten libraries. Subscribe, activate the bell, and come with me until the end, because what lies ahead, I swear to you, will mark you in a way that you cannot foresee right now. Now let's go back to Magdala. At some point in Miriam's adult life, something happened, something that changed everything. The Gospel of Luke, in chapter 8, verses 1 to 3, makes a quick, almost careless mention, but absolutely revealing. It says that Jesus was going through cities and villages preaching, and that along with him were the 12, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. And among these women, the Gospel mentions first and before any other, Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. And the text continues, saying that these women provided for them out of their substance. Stop, reread, because what is written there in a few lines is a theological bomb that no one usually disarms. First, Mary Magdalene had possessions. She had money. She had her own resources. She was not a beggar, she was not marginalized, she was not a repentant prostitute living off the charity of others. She was a financially independent woman who supported Jesus' movement with her own resources. In a society where women rarely had financial autonomy, this is a gigantic anomaly. This can only mean one thing. Either she was the widow of a rich man, or she inherited property, or she was a successful merchant in the fish industry of Magdala. In any case, she was powerful. And she used that power, that autonomy, to support a wandering preacher who was shaking the religious structures of her time. Second, the story of the 7 demons. This phrase, from whom 7 demons had gone out, has been used for centuries to suggest that Mary Magdalene was a troubled woman, possessed, possibly mentally or morally disturbed. But in the context of the 1st century, demons did not necessarily mean what it means today. It often meant illnesses, especially psychosomatic diseases, deep depressions, disorders that today would have other names. And the number 7 in Jewish tradition is the number of fullness, of totality. 7 demons can simply mean a complete, total, deep healing. A healing that changed her life, a healing that made her leave everything, her home, her city, her financial security, to follow that man from Galilee who had given her life back. Third, and perhaps most importantly, she is mentioned before the other women. In a culture where the order in which names appeared had enormous weight, this means that Mary Magdalene was first, the leader, the central figure of the female circle that followed Jesus. Not Mary, the mother of Jesus, not Salome, not Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward. Mary Magdalene, always first. In almost all lists of women in the 4 canonical Gospels, she appears first. Think about the weight of this. In a deeply patriarchal society, where women were treated as property of fathers and husbands, where they could not testify in courts, where they were prevented from studying the Torah, where they were separated from men in synagogues, a religious movement emerges led by a wandering carpenter who accepts women among his closest followers. And not only accepts, he gives them prominence, he gives them a voice, he gives them active roles. And at the center of this female circle is a woman who will be, after the Master's death, the first witness of the resurrection. But this is just the beginning, because the true story of Mary Magdalene, the story that has been systematically erased over the following centuries, is even more radical than this. And to understand it, we will need to dive into texts that have been buried in the Egyptian desert for over 1,600 years. Texts that, when finally discovered in 1945, shook the foundations of Christian orthodoxy. Texts that show a Mary Magdalene completely different from the one presented to us in Sunday sermons. Before descending into the catacombs and the lost manuscripts, It is essential to do something that few Christians have been invited to do throughout their lives. Read carefully, slowly, word by word, what the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, really say about Mary Magdalene. Not what the priests say they say, not what pastors paraphrase in their sermons, not what Hollywood movies imagine, what is actually written there, in black and white, for almost 2,000 years. Let's start with the oldest Gospel, that of Mark, written probably between the years 60 and 70 of the Christian era, about 40 years after the events it describes. Mark mentions Mary Magdalene for the first time in chapter 15, at the moment of the crucifixion. And what he says is impressive. He says that while Jesus was dying on the cross, there were also women looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the Less, and of Joseph, and Salome. And he adds a crucial piece of information, who, when he was in Galilee, followed him and ministered to him, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Stop at this verse, because it contains information that changes everything. The women followed him from Galilee. In Greek, the verb used is akolathein, which is the same verb used to describe the apostles. The apostles followed Jesus. The women also followed Jesus. They were not mere admirers. They were not occasional companions. They were followers, in the most technical and theological sense of the word. They were disciples. And more than that, while all 12 male apostles fled at the moment of the crucifixion, yes, all of them, without exception, according to Mark's own gospel, the women stayed. They were there, watching, suffering, witnessing. When the men ran to hide, fearing they would be arrested, the women remained. And among them, first and foremost, was Mary Magdalene. Mark's gospel continues. Chapter 15, verse 47. And Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, observed where he was laid. Who saw where the body of Jesus was placed? It was not Peter, who had denied 3 times. It was not John who had fled, it was the women, Mary Magdalene first. And then we come to chapter 16, the chapter of the resurrection. Verse 1. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices that they might come and anoint him, who went to the tomb on the morning of that first day of the week, still dark, with spices to anoint the body. It was not the apostles who were still locked in a room for fear of the Jews. It was the women. And among them first was Mary Magdalene. And what happened there? Verse 6. But he said to them, Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen, he is not here. Who heard firsthand the announcement of the resurrection? The women. And who was sent to announce this news to the apostles? Verse 7. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him. Who was the first messenger of Christianity? Mary Magdalene. Think about that. Think about the theological weight of that. Without her testimony, without her running to the upper room where the apostles were hiding, without her insistence in the face of their disbelief, Christianity would not have begun. The central event of the Christian faith, the resurrection, came to the world through the mouth of a woman who, according to the laws of the time, could not even testify in a court, a woman whose word, in any judicial context, was worth less than a man's word, and yet it was her word, her voice, her testimony that changed the world. The Gospel of Matthew, written a few years after Mark, repeats the same structure. Mary Magdalene at the cross, Mary Magdalene at the burial, Mary Magdalene at the resurrection. First, always. And Matthew adds an even bolder detail. The risen Jesus himself personally appears to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary before appearing to any of the apostles. Chapter 28, verse 9. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, All hail! And they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him. Who was the first person to touch the body of the resurrected Christ? It was a woman, it was 2 women, and they worshipped him, and he sent them, Go, and tell my brethren that they go into Galilee, and there they shall see me. The Gospel of Luke is a bit more cautious, a bit more reserved regarding the role of Mary Magdalene, perhaps because Luke, writing probably for a more Romanized, more Greek audience, more concerned with the social respectability of the new movement, felt the need to soften the female centrality. But still, Luke cannot completely erase Mary Magdalene. She appears, she is named, she is there, at the moment of the resurrection. And Luke records with an almost uncomfortable sincerity the reaction of the apostles when the women returned from the tomb with the news. And their words seemed to them as idle tales, and they believed them not. In other words, the men did not believe the women. They thought it was madness. They thought it was feminine invention, and they needed Peter to go see for himself, to start considering the possibility that those women were telling the truth. Think about the irony. The greatest truth in the history of Christianity was initially dismissed by men as feminine madness, and it was necessary for a man to confirm what the women had already seen and said, for their testimony to be taken seriously. Does this remind you of anything? Does it remind you of patterns that continue to happen 2,000 years later, on every corner, in every company, in every church, in every family conversation? But it is in the Gospel of John, the last to be written, probably at the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the 2nd, that Mary Magdalene receives the deepest, most intimate, most unforgettable treatment. Chapter 20 of the Gospel of John is, without exaggeration, one of the most moving texts ever written in all of Western literature. And its protagonist is her. She goes to the tomb alone, still in the dark, sees the stone removed, runs to Peter and to the disciple whom Jesus loved, possibly John, and gives the news. The two men run to the tomb, see that it is empty, and go back home. They go back home. This detail is crucial. The men, after seeing the empty tomb, simply go back home. But Mary Magdalene stays. She cannot leave. She stays weeping outside the tomb. And it is to her alone, weeping, that the risen Christ decides to appear. And here comes one of the most beautiful, delicate, and mysterious scenes in all sacred literature. Mary, still weeping, turns and sees someone whom she thinks is the gardener. She asks him if he was the one who took the body away. And the man says a single word, a word that changes the world. He says, Mary. He calls her by name. And at that moment, hearing her own name spoken by that unmistakable voice, she recognizes and replies, in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means master, but with an even greater intimacy, something like my beloved master. Why is this scene so important? Because it reveals an intimacy between Jesus and Mary Magdalene that is not described anywhere else in the canonical Gospels in relation to any other disciple. Peter never received a scene like this. John never received a scene like this. Thomas, later, will receive a famous scene, but it is a scene of proof, of physical verification, of disbelief overcome. The scene of Mary Magdalene in the garden is different. It is a scene of mutual recognition, of a voice calling by name, of a response that needs no proof, of faith that is itself knowledge. And it is in this scene that the risen Jesus gives Mary Magdalene a specific mission. Go to my brethren and say to them, I ascend to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. She is sent. She is an apostle. She is literally the first to be sent with the central message of Christianity. That is why, in some texts of the early church, she is called Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle of the apostles, the sent one of the sent ones. The messenger of the messengers. Stop and breathe. Because everything we have just read, everything without exception, is in the 4 canonical Gospels. It is in the Bible that is in your home, in your parents' home, in your grandparents' home. It is not apocryphal. It is not Gnostic. It is not heresy. It is official text. It is accepted text. It is canonical text. And yet, how many times have you heard preaching about this? How many times have you heard a priest, a pastor, a catechist, dedicate an entire sermon to explain that Christianity began with a woman running through the streets of Jerusalem to announce the resurrection to men who did not believe her? How many times? Probably none, or very few. Why? And it is precisely here that the most dangerous part of the story comes in. Because what happened over the following centuries was not a natural forgetting. It was not an accidental omission. It was an operation, a careful, deliberate, systematic operation of erasure. An operation that has a name, a face, a date, and even a specific sermon that can be identified as the exact moment when the lie was officially fabricated. The date is September 14th, 591. The place is the Basilica of St. Clement in Rome. The man is Gregory, newly elected pope, known to posterity as Gregory the Great, and what he is about to do, that autumn morning in Rome, will change the perception that the West will have of Mary Magdalene for the next 14 centuries. Gregory is a complex man. The son of an aristocratic Roman family, a former mayor of the city, he had abandoned public life to become a monk, transforming his family mansion into a monastery. He was a sophisticated intellectual, author of several books, organizer of the liturgy that still bears his name, Gregorian chant. He was also, and this is crucial to understanding what happened, a brilliant administrator, concerned with consolidating the power of the Church of Rome at a time of extreme political fragility. The Western Roman Empire had fallen a century earlier. Barbarian invasions were ravaging Europe. Plague was devastating entire cities. The Church needed to establish itself as an institution capable of offering order, authority, stability. And for that, it needed clear messages, simple symbols, unambiguous doctrines, characters that could be used to teach moral lessons to the people. And it was in this context that Gregory, on that September 14th, ascended to the pulpit and delivered the 33rd sermon of his homiletic collection, a sermon that at the time seemed just another pastoral reflection, a sermon that, in reality, was a surgical operation of reputational demolition. What Gregory did was simple and devastating. He took 3 different women mentioned in 3 different passages of the Gospels and declared with the authority of the throne of Peter that they were in fact one and the same woman. The 3 women were Mary Magdalene, mentioned in Luke 8 as the one from whom 7 demons had gone out, Mary of Bethany, sister of Martha and Lazarus, who anointed Jesus' feet with perfume, and the sinful woman of Luke 7, who is unnamed, and who entered the house of Simon the Pharisee, washed Jesus' feet with her tears, and wiped them with her hair. 3 women, 3 distinct characters, 3 completely different contexts. And Gregory, with one stroke, transformed the 3 into one, and worse still, attributed to the woman resulting from this fusion, now called Mary Magdalene, the identity of the sinful woman of Luke 7. And what was the sin of this unnamed woman? The text does not say. At no point. There is not a single word in the entire Gospel of Luke that specifies what the sin of that woman who anointed Jesus' feet was. But Gregory, in his sermon, decided for all of us. The sin was prostitution. And the 7 demons mentioned in Luke 8, according to Gregory, were the 7 deadly sins, including, of course, lust. In a single homily, Mary Magdalene was transformed from apostle of the apostles, first witness of the resurrection, leader of the female circle of disciples, a woman of means and autonomy, into a repentant prostitute who lived crying at Jesus' feet as a sign of penitence for her sexual sins. The messenger was transformed into a sinner. The leader was transformed into a penitent. The powerful woman was transformed into a symbol of female sin tamed by male mercy. And this transformation, this lie inaugurated by a papal sermon, was repeated, taught, painted, sculpted, staged, preached, sung over the following centuries. Medieval and Renaissance artists represented her naked, with long red hair covering her repentant body. Religious orders dedicated to fallen women were baptized with her name. The famous Magdalene houses, which existed in various European countries until very recently, like the sadly infamous Magdalene laundries in Ireland, where women considered immoral were imprisoned and forced to work as slaves, officially closed only in 1996. 1400 years after Gregory's sermon, women were still being punished in the name of a false identification created by a pope who needed a convenient symbol for his political and moral agenda. The Catholic Church, it is fair to say, has finally recognized the error. In 1969, more than 1300 years after Gregory's sermon, the Roman liturgical calendar was revised. The feast of Mary Magdalene, which previously mentioned her identification with the sinful woman, was corrected. The title of penitent was removed, and in 2016 Pope Francis elevated her celebration to the same level as the feasts of the apostles, and the Congregation for Divine Worship officially declared that Mary Magdalene should be called Apostle of the Apostles. 1400 years to correct what should never have been said, but the damage was already done. The image of the repentant prostitute is so deeply ingrained in Western culture that hardly anyone, upon hearing the name Mary Magdalene, thinks first of Apostle of the Apostles. They automatically think of redeemed sinner, and this automatic association is a perfect example of what Spinoza, in his theological political treatise, described as the power of religious institutions to shape the perception of the faithful to the point of preventing them from seeing the truth that is right before their eyes, written in the very sacred texts they read. Spinoza did not know, of course, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, which would only be discovered nearly 300 years after his death, but he had already grasped the general principle. In his masterpiece of biblical hermeneutics, he formulated a series of rules for the correct interpretation of the scriptures. And among these rules, one of the most important was this: it is necessary to distinguish between what the sacred text actually says and what later tradition says it says. Because, over the centuries, commentators, theologians, popes, councils have been adding layers and layers of interpretation, association, symbolism, moralization. And over time, these layers became so thick, so heavy, so seemingly natural that the faithful began to confuse them with the text itself, to read into the Bible things that are not written there, to not read things that are clearly written there. The case of Mary Magdalene is perhaps the most flagrant example of this phenomenon in the entire history of Western Christianity. But why did Gregory do this? Why did he feel the need to transform an apostle into a prostitute? The answer involves a combination of theological, political, and cultural factors that are worth examining carefully because it reveals much about how power works in any era, in any institution. First, there is the issue of the role of women in the church. In the early centuries of Christianity, especially in the urban communities of the Eastern Mediterranean, women had active roles. There are archaeological records of women bishops, women presbyters, women deacons. There are letters from Paul that mention women as important collaborators: Phoebe, Junia, Priscilla. But as Christianity became consolidated as the official religion of the Roman Empire, starting with the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, the ecclesiastical hierarchy quickly became masculinized. Councils began to exclude women from ordained ministries. Rites began to be celebrated only by men. Female voices began to be silenced, marginalized, contained. In this context, having a figure like Mary Magdalene, a woman called Apostle of the Apostles by the early church fathers, like Hippolytus of Rome in the 3rd century, was a problem. She was an uncomfortable witness that, in the beginning, it had not been like that. She was living evidence that early Christianity had space for female leadership. And there were two ways to deal with this problem: either recognize her importance and reopen the debate about the role of women, or transform her into something more palatable for the patriarchal structure that was consolidating. Gregory chose the second option, and he chose it, it is fair to say, without necessarily realizing the magnitude of what he was doing. He probably genuinely believed he was unifying disparate figures into a coherent narrative. He probably thought he was offering a powerful symbol of redemption, capable of touching the hearts of sinners, but the objective effect of his choice was devastating, and it fit perfectly with the institutional agenda of a church that needed to neutralize the memory of female leadership in the origins of the Christian movement. Secondly, there is the issue of control over sexuality. The medieval church was obsessed with sexuality, especially female sexuality, which it saw as a dangerous, threatening force capable of diverting men from virtue. And having a woman repentant of sexual sins as a model of penitence was a powerful pedagogical tool. Mary Magdalene, transformed into a redeemed prostitute, became the perfect symbol to teach women that even the most fallen of them could be forgiven, as long as they submitted to the authority of the church, abandoned their autonomy, lived in penitence, and depended on divine and clerical male mercy. In third place, and perhaps most importantly, there is the issue of neutralizing the intimacy between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The canonical Gospels, especially John's, reveal a closeness between the two that is difficult to explain within the parameters of a merely spiritual discipleship. The recognition in the garden, the calling by name, the response in Aramaic, the gesture of touching him, all of this suggests a deeply intimate relationship. And this intimacy, for a celibate church that was building its power on the idea of Christ's sexual purity and that of his closest followers, was a problem. One way to neutralize this intimacy was to reframe it as the relationship between a saint and a redeemed sinner, an asymmetrical, hierarchical relationship with no possibility of equality. Spinoza would say, centuries later, "Always observe who benefits from an interpretation. Always observe the political and institutional consequences of a doctrine. Always observe the power behind the word that is said to be divine. And by observing this, you will begin to see things that have been hidden right under your nose your whole life." December 1945, Egypt, near the small town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, about 80 kilometers north of Luxor, a peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman left home that morning with his brothers to collect natural fertilizer, a type of nitrogen-rich soil that accumulated at the bases of the nearby limestone cliffs. It was a routine job, repeated for generations. No one expected anything extraordinary that day, but the history of Christianity was about to be rewritten. While digging at the foot of a cliff called Jabal al-Tarif, Muhammad Ali felt his pickaxe strike something hard. It was not stone, it was pottery. He continued digging carefully and soon discovered a large sealed clay jar, about a meter tall. He hesitated for a moment. He was afraid of what might be inside. A jinn, perhaps, an evil spirit that would escape if the jar were opened. But curiosity, and the hope of finding gold, spoke louder. He broke the lid. And instead of gold or jinns, he found something that at that moment seemed completely useless. 13 leather-bound codices, filled with yellowed pages covered in strange writing in a language he did not know. Those codices, unbeknownst to anyone at the time, were possibly the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century for the study of early Christianity. More important, in a certain sense, even than the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered 2 years later in 1947. Because the Nag Hammadi manuscripts contained over 50 Christian texts, in Coptic, the language of ancient Christian Egypt that had been hidden in the desert likely in the late 4th century, to escape the campaign of destruction of heretical literature promoted by ecclesiastical authorities after the establishment of Nicene Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. These texts, forgotten for more than 1600 years, were considered apocryphal, Gnostic, heretical. They had been condemned by the Church Fathers, listed in catalogues of prohibited works, burned in public bonfires. But in the oasis of Nag Hammadi, in a monastery likely linked to the community of St. Pachomius, someone, some monk, some community, decided that those texts were too precious to be destroyed, and they hid them, and they buried them, and they remained there in silence, waiting for almost a millennium and a half, until the pickaxe of an Egyptian peasant brought them back to light. The trajectory of the manuscripts after their discovery is an odyssey in itself. Sold by intermediaries, smuggled, partially destroyed, some of them used by Muhammad Ali's mother to light the stove, others sold to antiquarians in Cairo, one ending up in the hands of Carl Gustav Jung, who gifted it to the Jung Institute in Zurich. It took decades for scholars from around the world to finally gain access to the complete content of the codices, and when that access was finally consolidated with the publication of the so-called Nag Hammadi Library in facsimile in the 1970s, what was discovered was breathtaking. Among the texts were Gospels that no one had read in over 1,500 years, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Truth, Gospel of the Egyptians, Apocryphon of John, Sophia of Jesus Christ, and many others, texts that showed a much more diverse, plural, and complex early Christianity than that presented by Orthodox tradition, a Christianity where there were multiple currents, multiple theologies, multiple communities, each with its own sacred texts, its own interpretations, its own practices. And among these texts, two of them refer directly and spectacularly to Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, and not found in Nag Hammadi but discovered separately a few years earlier in the late 19th century, the Gospel of Mary. Let's start with the Gospel of Philip. This text, probably dated to the 2nd or 3rd century, is a collection of theological, mystical, and symbolic reflections. It is not narrative like the canonical Gospels. It is more a series of aphorisms, meditations, comments. And, amidst these reflections, there are two passages that are absolutely explosive regarding Mary Magdalene. The first passage says, in an approximate translation from Coptic, "There were three who always walked with the Lord, Mary his mother and her sister, and Magdalene, who was called his companion." Stop at this sentence. Three Marys walked with the Lord, the mother, the sister of the mother, and Magdalene. And Magdalene was called his companion. The original Greek word used in this context, koinonos, has multiple meanings. It can mean business partner, associate, spiritual companion, but also, in certain contexts, partner in the most intimate, conjugal sense. The ambiguity of the word opens up a vast field of interpretations, and this ambiguity in itself is already disconcerting. Why did the author of this gospel choose such a loaded word to describe the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene? The second passage is even bolder and is perhaps one of the most discussed passages in all of ancient Christian literature. It says, "And the companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. The Christ loved her more than all the disciples, and he used to kiss her often on her," word lost in the manuscript. The other disciples were offended by this and expressed their disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" The Savior replied, saying to them, "Why do I not love you as I love her?" The word that is missing in the original manuscript, the word that would indicate where exactly Jesus kissed Mary Magdalene, is one of the most famous and tantalizing gaps in all of Christian paleography. Some reconstructions suggest mouth, others suggest face, others suggest forehead. Each of these reconstructions implies a completely different interpretation of the relationship between the two. And, as the word is irretrievably lost, we will never know for sure what was written there. But more important than the lost word is what is clearly written around it. It is written that Jesus loved her more than the other disciples. It is written that this caused jealousy and resentment among the men. It is written that Jesus, when confronted, openly defended his preference for Mary Magdalene. And it is written that the relationship between the two was of a kind that the others considered exceptional, special, perhaps even excessive. Now, it is important to make a methodological note. The Gospel of Philip is not a historical account in the sense we give to the term today. It is a text of theological and mystical reflection, probably written 150 to 200 years after the events it describes. We cannot read it as if it were a journalistic document, but at the same time, it is a precious witness to how certain ancient Christian communities, possibly communities that preserved older traditions, closer to the origins, remembered the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And this memory, clearly, was very different from that preserved by later Orthodox Christianity. The Gospel of Mary, discovered in 1896 by the German antiquarian Karl Reinhardt in a bookstore in Cairo, and published for the first time in 1955, is even more impressive. It is the only known ancient Christian gospel that bears the name of a woman, not the Gospel according to Mary, but the Gospel of Mary. And this Mary is, without any possible ambiguity in context, Mary Magdalene. The text that has come down to us is fragmentary. Several pages are missing, possibly the most important ones. But what has survived is enough to give us an extraordinary insight. The scenario is as follows. Jesus, after the resurrection, appears to the disciples, instructs them, and then departs. The disciples are shaken, confused, afraid. Peter speaks on behalf of the group. If they did not spare the Master, how will they spare us? They weep, lament, do not know what to do. And it is then that Mary Magdalene takes the floor. She stands up, embraces the other disciples, and says, "Do not weep, and do not be sad, and do not doubt, for his grace will be completely with you and will protect you. Rather, let us praise his greatness, for he has prepared us and made us men. This last phrase, made us men, in Coptic, has a meaning close to made us complete human beings, made us mature. It is a phrase of spiritual leadership. It is a phrase that only someone with recognized authority could pronounce. And the disciples, according to the text, calm down. They turn to her. And Peter, in a sentence that changes everything, asks her, "Sister, we know that the Savior loved you more than the other women. Tell us the words of the Savior that you remember, the ones you know but that we do not know, nor have we heard." Stop, reread this passage. Peter, the same Peter who, according to Orthodox tradition, received from Jesus the keys to the kingdom of heaven, is asking Mary Magdalene for teachings. He is recognizing that she had knowledge that the other apostles did not have. He is admitting that the Savior loved her more than the other women, and he is, in essence, sitting at her feet like a student at the feet of a teacher. And Mary Magdalene begins to teach. She recounts a vision she had of the Savior. She describes a journey of the soul through different spheres of power. She conveys teachings about the nature of the Spirit, about liberation from matter, about the path of ascension. And it is in this teaching, which reaches us in a fragmentary form, with several pages lost, that the theological heart of the Gospel of Mary resides. But then something even more revealing happens. When Mary finishes speaking, Andrew, Peter's brother, expresses skepticism. Say what you think about what she said. I, at least, do not believe that the Savior said this, because these doctrines are certainly strange ideas. And Peter, the same Peter who had asked for her teachings, joins his brother and attacks. Did he really speak in secret with a woman before us and not openly? Should we all turn and listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? And Mary weeps. The text states this explicitly. She weeps, and she responds to Peter with one of the most moving phrases in all of ancient Christian literature. "My brother Peter, what do you think? Do you think I invented this alone in my heart, or that I am lying about the Savior?" And it is Levi, not Peter, not Andrew, who defends her. Levi says, "Peter, you have always been hasty. Now I see that you are contending against the woman as against the adversaries. But if the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Certainly the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us." Think of the theological, historical, and political weight of this scene. For the first centuries of Christianity, in some communities, a text circulated that openly described a conflict between Peter and Mary Magdalene over spiritual authority. A conflict in which Peter questioned the validity of the teachings transmitted by a woman, and in which another disciple, Levi, took her side, reminding that the Savior himself had chosen her as the most beloved. This conflict, this clash between a charismatic feminine authority and a male institutional authority, is precisely the conflict that the later history of Christianity would resolve, in favor of Peter, in favor of the male structure, in favor of silencing the female voice. And the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, along with the Gospel of Mary, are the material witnesses, in parchment, in ink, in Coptic, that this silencing was not natural. It was chosen. It was imposed. It was ultimately overcome through power. To understand what was truly at stake in the conflict between Peter and Mary Magdalene, described in the Gospel of Mary, and in several other texts of the so-called Christian Gnostic literature, one must go deeper. One must understand what these communities believed, what they were trying to preserve, and why all of this was systematically eliminated by the currents of Christianity that ultimately triumphed and became what we now call orthodoxy. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek gnosis, which means knowledge, but not just any kind of knowledge, not the knowledge learned from books or memorized in school. It was a specific type of knowledge, an experiential, inner, transformative knowledge. A knowledge obtained through direct revelation, mystical experience, personal contact with the divine. It was, in a sense, the opposite of what the institutional church was becoming. While the institutional church said, "You need the clergy to access God. You need the sacraments administered by priests. You need the hierarchy of the church to ensure your salvation," the Gnostics said, "Every human soul has within it a spark of the divine, and the path to salvation is to descend to that spark, awaken it, and let it illuminate your entire existence. Can you see why these two visions were incompatible? Why one of them had to be eliminated for the other to prevail? If each person has direct access to the divine through their own inner experience, then the clergy becomes unnecessary. If salvation depends on personal transformation, then the sacraments lose their centrality. If religious truth is accessible to any sincere soul, then institutional authority no longer has a monopoly on it. For a church that was building itself as an institution, with hierarchy, with properties, with political power, with financial revenue, Gnostic theology was an existential threat, and it needed to be destroyed. And it was destroyed. The texts were burned, the communities were dispersed, the teachers were excommunicated. The bishops who preached Gnostic ideas were deposed. In a few centuries, Gnostic Christianity, which in some regions and at some times was as numerous as Orthodox Christianity, was practically erased from historical memory. When, during the Renaissance and later in the following centuries, some scholars began to take an interest in ancient Gnostic texts, they had to reconstruct this universe from small fragments cited by their enemies, by church fathers like Irenaeus of Lyons, Tertullian, Hippolytus, Epiphanius, who wrote entire treatises refuting the Gnostics and citing their doctrines to condemn them. It was only with Nag Hammadi in 1945 that for the first time in over 1,500 years, these texts could be read directly, in their own words, without the hostile filter of their adversaries. And what was discovered was a radically different Christianity, more mystical, more philosophical, more individual, less hierarchical, and, this is the crucial point for our investigation, much more open to female leadership. Several Gnostic texts attributed central spiritual roles to women. Some Gnostic communities had women prophets, others had women who celebrated rites, others had sacred texts in which divine wisdom, called in Greek Sophia, was portrayed as a cosmic feminine figure, equal in dignity to the masculine logos. And among the most venerated female human figures in various of these communities, Mary Magdalene shone at the top of the list. She appears in the Gospel of Thomas. She appears in the Dialogue of the Saviour. She appears in the Sophia of Jesus Christ. She appears in the Pistis Sophia, a long Gnostic treatise where in one of the passages Jesus says to her, "Mary, blessed are you, whom I will perfect in all the mysteries of the heights. Speak freely, you whose heart is directed to the kingdom of heaven more than all your brothers." In another passage of the Pistis Sophia, it is Mary who asks most of the questions to Jesus. Almost all the central theological discussions of the book are initiated by a question from her. And in a memorable scene, Peter complains, "Master, we cannot bear this woman who takes the opportunity from us and does not allow any of us to speak." But she herself speaks many times. Peter's complaint against Mary Magdalene, which appeared in the Gospel of Mary, also echoes here, as a recurring complaint, in various traditions, against the centrality of this woman. And it is precisely this centrality, this prominence, this authority, this voice, that the Orthodox tradition needed to erase. Not because the Gnostic texts about Mary Magdalene were necessarily more true than the canonical ones in the strict historical sense. Perhaps they were not. Perhaps they represented, in part, later theological projections. But they undeniably represented an alternative memory. A memory that said there was another possibility, there was another path, there were other voices. And this alternative memory needed to be silenced for the official memory to impose itself as the only true one. Here is where Spinoza's analysis becomes especially revealing. In his theological political treatise, he develops an idea that, at the time, was scandalous, but which today, with everything we know about the history of the formation of the biblical canon, sounds almost like a truism. The idea is this: the choice of which books are sacred and which are not is in itself a human, political, institutional decision. It is not a divine decision. It is a decision made by concrete men, at concrete moments, with concrete interests. When, throughout the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, Christian bishops and theologians were fixing what would come to be called the New Testament, they were making choices. They were deciding, this book goes in, this book does not go in. This text is apostolic, this one is not. This one is inspired, this one is apocryphal. And these decisions, although presented as revealed, as guided by the Holy Spirit, as manifestations of authentic tradition, were, in practice, made based on very concrete criteria. Which texts served the theology that was wanted to be established? Which texts confirmed the institutional structure that was being built? Which texts were popular in which regions? Which texts were supported by which influential bishops? The texts that portrayed Mary Magdalene as an apostle, as a teacher, as a privileged interlocutor of Jesus, were excluded. Not because anyone proved they were false, but because they were inconvenient. They were politically incompatible with the type of church that was being built. They were theologically dangerous to the male hierarchical structure that was consolidating. Spinoza dared to ask. And this question, in his time, cost him excommunication and, for a long time, his posthumous reputation. If the scriptures are, in part, the result of human choices, with what authority can someone say that these choices were correct? With what authority can someone say that the excluded books were not equally inspired? With what authority can someone say that religious truth coincides exactly with what the bishops of the 4th century decided to preserve? For Spinoza, the answer was clear. No one can say this with any authority other than the authority of reason itself, examining the texts, comparing them, judging them on their own merit. And when we apply this method to the texts about Mary Magdalene, what we discover is that there is more to her story than what tradition wanted to tell us, much more. But there is an even more radical aspect of Spinoza's contribution to understanding the case of Mary Magdalene, and it is an aspect that few have explored with the depth it deserves. Spinoza did not believe in miracles in the traditional sense of the term. For him, nature obeys fixed, eternal laws, which are the expression of the divine essence itself. God, for Spinoza, is not a personal being who intervenes in the world arbitrarily. God is the infinite, eternal, necessary substance that expresses itself in everything that exists. And the miracles described in the scriptures, according to him, are often reflections of how the ancients understood natural phenomena that they still did not have the capacity to explain, or are later additions made by scribes who wanted to enhance the supernatural aura of the characters. Applying this view to the figure of Mary Magdalene is fascinating. The 7 demons that came out of her, according to Luke, can be read from a Spinozist perspective, not as a supernatural intervention, but as a profound inner transformation, a psychic healing, a liberation from a mental or emotional suffering that paralyzed her. And this transformation, this liberation, is what opens in her the capacity for extraordinary spiritual perception. In other words, Mary Magdalene, free from her demons and whatever the nature of those demons, becomes capable of an understanding of reality that others, trapped in their own psychological demons, cannot reach. This explains for Spinoza why she, and not the other disciples, is able to see the risen Christ. Not because she was the object of a particular supernatural intervention, but because her inner capacity for spiritual perception was more developed. She saw what others did not see. She heard what others did not hear. And when she tries to convey this vision to the disciples, they reject her as madness, as strange ideas, exactly as at any time any authentic prophet or thinker is rejected by their contemporaries who do not yet have their eyes opened to the truth they announce. This Spinozist reading, rational, naturalistic, but at the same time deeply respectful of the spiritual dimension of the phenomenon, offers us a completely new way of understanding the figure of Mary Magdalene, not as a miracle-working saint, not as a repentant sinner, but as a woman of extraordinary spiritual intelligence, whose inner perception was more developed than that of her male contemporaries, and who therefore was able to understand Jesus' message on a level that they, due to their own psychological and cultural limitations, could not reach. A woman who, for that very reason, became a threat to male spiritual authority, and who needed to be silenced not because she was wrong, but because she was too right. To reach the heart of the contribution that Spinoza can offer to the understanding of the case of Mary Magdalene, it is necessary to dive deeper into what he proposed in his theological political treatise, a work that, when published anonymously in Amsterdam in 1670, caused a scandal of continental proportions, Calvinists denounced it as a work of the devil. Lutherans burned it in public squares. Catholics placed it on the index of forbidden books. The Jews, of course, had already excommunicated its author 14 years earlier. And even the most advanced thinkers of the time, such as Leibniz, wrote private letters expressing horror at the audacity of those pages. Within a few months, the work had been banned in almost all jurisdictions of Europe. And yet, clandestine copies circulated from hand to hand, hidden in travel blankets, translated into pirate versions, read silently in the private libraries of the continent's most courageous spirits. What was in that book that provoked such a violent reaction? First of all, Spinoza proposed something that today seems evident, but which was revolutionary in his time. The Bible must be studied with the same methods used to study other ancient books. Not with blind reverence, not with dogmatic submission, but with the instrument of critical reason, philological analysis, and historical contextualization. For Spinoza, this meant a series of concrete operations. It meant examining the original language in which each book was written. It meant investigating the historical and cultural circumstances in which each author lived. It meant comparing passages with each other to identify contradictions, repetitions, anachronisms. It meant distinguishing between what can reasonably be attributed to the original author and what seems to have been added by copyists, editors, later redactors. This method, which we now call historical criticism or biblical criticism, was inaugurated by Spinoza. Before him, daring to apply critical reason to sacred texts was considered heresy. After him, this method would become the standard of biblical scholarship in all serious universities around the world, first in the Protestant universities of 19th century Germany, then in Catholic universities from the 20th century onward, and later in all theology colleges worldwide. And the results of this method, systematically applied over the last 350 years, have radically transformed our understanding of practically all biblical texts. We now know, for example, that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, traditionally attributed to Moses, was not written by Moses. It was composed over centuries, from at least 4 different sources, with different vocabularies, different theologies, different perspectives, which were interwoven by later redactors. We know that the book of Isaiah, which was traditionally attributed to a single prophet, was actually composed by at least 3 different authors, living in times separated by centuries. We know that many of the letters attributed to Paul in the New Testament were likely not written by him, but by his disciples who wrote in his name, a common practice in antiquity, which was not considered forgery, but a way to honor the Master. We know that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by the characters whose names they bear, but were attributed to those characters in later times, when Christian communities needed to give apostolic authority to their sacred texts. All of this is now consensus among serious scholars, and all of this began with Spinoza. But Spinoza went further. He did not settle for proposing a method. He also proposed a theory about why these texts were written the way they were, and about how we should interpret them today. For Spinoza, the biblical prophets were not passive channels of a divine revelation dictated word for word. They were men, and sometimes women, of especially vivid imagination, capable of communicating deep moral and spiritual truths in symbolic, poetic, mythical language. Their inspiration was not rational, in the strict philosophical sense, but imaginative, in the prophetic sense. They spoke to their people in their time, using the images and concepts that those people could understand, and we, reading those words thousands of years later, in radically different cultures, need to do careful translation work to extract from them the enduring truths they continue to carry. This translation work, according to Spinoza, requires a fundamental distinction, the distinction between the spirit and the letter of the Scriptures. The spirit is the essential moral and spiritual message. For Spinoza, this message could be summarized in 2 maxims: love God above all things and love your neighbor as yourself. These 2 maxims, he argued, are the heart of all true religions and are present in different forms in all the sacred scriptures of humanity. The letter is everything else: the concrete narratives, the historical details, the specific rituals, the cultural prescriptions. The letter is circumstantial, contingent, tied to a time and a place. The Spirit is universal, eternal, valid for all human beings in all times. When we apply this distinction to the case of Mary Magdalene, something important is revealed. The letter of the narratives about her, the specific details, the particular scenes, the exact words recorded by the different Gospels, can be the subject of historical and critical discussion. We can debate whether a particular scene really happened, whether a particular phrase was really spoken, whether a particular interpretation corresponds to the original author's intention. But the spirit of her story, the essential message that this figure carries, is something we can discern clearly, and that has profound implications for how we understand Christianity and for how we live our own lives. And what is the spirit of the story of Mary Magdalene? Spinoza did not write, as far as we know, any specific treatise about her. But from the general principles of his thought, we can extract an answer. The spirit of the story of Mary Magdalene is the testimony that the deepest spiritual truth can emerge in the most unexpected places and bodies. That wisdom has no gender, no caste, no hierarchy. That inner liberation, the expulsion of the 7 demons, as the Gospel says, is what enables someone to perceive ultimate reality. That the perception of this reality can only be communicated to those who are prepared to receive it, and that even among the closest disciples of the Master, there are always those who understand more deeply and those who understand less, and that, in this specific story, it was a woman from Magdala, a woman who had been healed of her own inner demons, who understood most deeply. There is also another aspect of Spinoza's philosophy that dramatically illuminates the case of Mary Magdalene, and it is the political aspect. Spinoza was one of the first modern thinkers to clearly analyze the political use of religion. In his theological political treatise, he systematically examines how religious authorities, throughout history, have used specific theological doctrines to maintain control over the masses. He shows how the fear of hell, the promise of paradise, the threat of excommunication, the sacralization of clerical hierarchy, are all political instruments disguised as spiritual messages, and he proposes, as an antidote to this instrumental use of religion, a clear separation between religious power and political power, and a passionate defense of freedom of thought as the supreme good of any civilized society. When we apply this political analysis to the case of Mary Magdalene, what we see is exactly that, the instrumental use of a religious figure for political and institutional purposes. Her transformation into a repentant prostitute, carried out by Gregory the Great in 591, was not a theological accident. It was a political operation. It served to neutralize the memory of female leadership in the origins of Christianity. It served to offer a model of female submission that reinforced the patriarchal structure of the medieval church. It served to project onto the women of the time an ideology of sexual sin and penance that justified clerical control over female bodies. And this political operation was not done once and stopped. It was continuously renewed over the centuries, in thousands of sermons, thousands of theological treatises, thousands of paintings, thousands of sculptures. Every time a priest, from the height of his pulpit, said, like Mary Magdalene, the redeemed sinner, he was reinforcing this political operation. Every time a painter depicted Mary Magdalene naked, with long hair covering her penitent body, he was reinforcing this political operation. Every time an institution like the Magdalene Laundries in Ireland imprisoned women in her name, it was reinforcing this political operation. Gregory's lie reproduced itself for 14 centuries, creating a cultural reality that even today, even after being officially corrected, continues to condition the way the West perceives this figure. And here is perhaps the most important lesson that Spinoza can teach us about the case of Mary Magdalene. No religious lie is merely religious. Every religious lie is also political. Every religious lie serves someone, benefits someone, keeps someone in power. And to free oneself from these lies, it is not enough to correct the facts. It is necessary to understand the power structures that fabricated them, that kept them alive, and that still resist seeing them completely undone. It is necessary, in other words, to do what Spinoza did in his time, and what continues to be necessary to do in ours, to think with courage, with lucidity, without submission to any authority other than the authority of reason itself and of one's own experience. There comes a moment, in the study of any complex historical figure, when the investigation of facts must give way to a deeper reflection on the meaning of that figure for us, now, in this 21st century in which we live. The facts are important, fundamental, non-negotiable. Without them, any reflection becomes fantasy, projection, daydream. But the facts alone are not enough. They need to be interpreted, situated, connected to our own lives. Otherwise, they remain like museum pieces, interesting but inert, objects of academic curiosity without the capacity to transform the present. Why does Mary Magdalene, 2,000 years after her death, continue to be such a powerful figure, so capable of mobilizing reflection, so recurrent in works of art, in novels, in films, in series, in theological discussions, and in contemporary spiritual movements? Why, even after so many centuries of institutional silencing, does she continue to resurface, like an underground water that always finds new ways to emerge to the surface? What does she represent, ultimately, that continues to touch us so deeply? There are several possible answers to this question, and each reveals something important about our time. The first answer is the most obvious, but also the most political. Mary Magdalene represents the repressed memory of female leadership in the origins of Christianity. And this memory, at a time when women are finally gaining, after millennia of exclusion, spaces of authority in religion, science, politics, and the arts, resonates with particular force. She is, in a sense, the unofficial patron saint of all women who throughout history have been silenced, of all the prophetesses who were called mad, of all the female scientists who were accused of witchcraft, of all the female philosophers who were erased from textbooks, of all the female writers who had to publish under male pseudonyms, of all the religious leaders who were excluded from altars. When a contemporary woman in any corner of the world discovers the true story of Mary Magdalene, she is simultaneously discovering something about her own spiritual and intellectual genealogy. She is discovering that she is not the first, that there were others before her, that this struggle for recognition is ancient, deep, persistent, and that it has illustrious witnesses on the side of those who were silenced. The second answer is more subtle and has to do with what Mary Magdalene represents in terms of an alternative spirituality. Throughout the centuries, even when her official history was distorted, her figure continued to inspire forms of devotion that escaped institutional control. Medieval mystics like Margaret of Cortona, Beatrice of Nazareth, Mechthild of Magdeburg saw in Mary Magdalene a sister, a model, a privileged interlocutor. Communities of women gathered in convents, especially in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, developed an intense devotion to her, seeing in her figure a representation of the feminine soul capable of a direct and loving relationship with the divine. The Provençal troubadours, in poems that mixed human love and mystical love, frequently invoked her figure, and even in popular traditions, in festivals, in pilgrimages, in sanctuary caves like that of Saint-Baume in Provence, where, according to a legendary tradition, Mary Magdalene spent the last 30 years of her life in contemplative meditation. Her presence remained alive, more as a friend than as a sinner, more as a teacher than as a penitent. Spinoza, for his own philosophical reasons, greatly valued this type of direct spirituality, unmediated by institutions. For him, the deepest relationship of the human being with the divine, which he called the intellectual love of God, required no priest, no sacrament, no hierarchy. It required only the inner liberation of the subject, their ability to think clearly, to feel deeply, to understand that they themselves are part of the infinite substance that is God. And this inner liberation, according to Spinoza, is what constitutes true beatitude, true salvation, the true end of human existence. When we read the narratives about Mary Magdalene in light of this philosophy, we perceive a curious convergence. She seems to embody exactly this type of direct spirituality. In the garden, after the resurrection, she does not need intermediaries to recognize Christ. She simply hears her name being pronounced and knows. In the Gospel of Mary, She conveys teachings she received not through a priest, not through a hierarchy, but through a direct vision. In Pistis Sophia, she is praised by Jesus precisely because her heart is more inclined to the kingdom of heaven than that of any other disciple. In all these texts, she represents the path of inner experience against the path of external authority, the path of personal love against the path of institutional obedience, the path of liberation against the path of submission. And it is precisely this path that official Christianity needed to disavow over the centuries to preserve its power structure. Because if people began to believe that they could have direct access to the divine without going through the clergy, without buying indulgences, without participating in the sacraments, without submitting to bishops and popes, the entire institutional edifice would collapse. Mary Magdalene, in her original version, was a threat to that edifice. That is why she had to be converted into a repentant prostitute, a version of her that, instead of pointing to the possibility of direct spiritual experience, pointed to the need for clerical mediation and institutional penance. The third answer, perhaps the deepest, has to do with something that can be called the femininity of the divine. Throughout most of the history of Western monotheistic religions, the divine has been imagined as predominantly masculine: God the Father, God the Son, patriarchs, male prophets, kings, priests, bishops. The very theological language, in all Indo-European languages, naturally assigns masculine pronouns to the divine. And this persistent masculinization of the divine has had profound cultural consequences, not only in the way societies have treated concrete women, but also in the way every human being, man or woman, has been educated to think about their own internal feminine dimensions. But beneath this masculinized surface, there has always been an underground current that insisted on recalling the femininity of the divine. In Judaism, there is the Shekinah, the presence of God that dwells in the world, often described in feminine terms. There is Sophia, divine wisdom, which appears in books like Proverbs and Ecclesiasticus as a cosmic feminine figure. In Christianity, there is the Virgin Mary, whose veneration, especially from the Middle Ages onward, reached levels such that, in some popular traditions, she practically assumed the role of a goddess. And there is, of course, Mary Magdalene, who, in various mystical currents, has been understood as a human incarnation of this feminine dimension of the divine, complementary to the masculine dimension embodied in Christ. We are not talking here about dogmatically affirming a particular theology. We are merely observing a recurring cultural phenomenon, the human need to imagine the divine in terms that include both the masculine and the feminine, both the father and the mother, both the husband and the wife, both the brother and the sister. This need, however repressed it may have been by official theologies, has always found ways to express itself, and Mary Magdalene, in various mystical and popular traditions, has been one of the main figures through which this need found voice. Spinoza, once again, helps us think about this interestingly. For him, the divine substance is infinite, and therefore contains within itself all possibilities, all attributes, all dimensions. Speaking of God as he or she is ultimately a limited metaphor, derived from our finite human categories. The divine reality transcends these categories, and yet, as finite human beings, we need images, metaphors, characters that help us relate to the infinite. And it is important that these images, these metaphors, these characters include all the richness of human experience, masculine and feminine, active and contemplative, rational and intuitive, social and solitary. Restricting images of the divine to only one pole, only the masculine, only the active, only the rational, impoverishes our relationship with ultimate reality. Mary Magdalene, in her full dignity, not as a repentant prostitute, but as the apostle of the apostles, as Peter's teacher, as the first witness of the resurrection, as a woman freed from her 7 demons and capable of extraordinary spiritual perception, is a figure that helps us recover this richness. She reminds us that wisdom also has a woman's face, that prophecy also has a woman's voice, that holiness also has a woman's body, that the sacred history of the West, if read without the patriarchal filters that distorted it for centuries, is a history in which men and women walk side by side, in which the divine spark ignites in the hearts of all genders, in which the ultimate truth can be revealed, both through a man from Galilee named Jesus and through a woman from Magdala named Miriam. This is the Mary Magdalene we are rediscovering at the beginning of the 21st century, not the invention of Gregory the Great, not the character of so many medieval and modern sermons, but the real woman, or at least the closest possible to the real woman, that the ancient texts, canonical and Gnostic, allow us to glimpse. A woman whose story, whose voice, whose wisdom were repressed for 14 centuries by the theological machine of fear, but who now, thanks to the joint work of archaeologists, philologists, historians, critical theologians, and also thanks to the free spirit of thinkers like Spinoza, is finally coming back to light. And this return to light, far from being merely an academic exercise, is a spiritual and cultural event of immense importance for our time. Because it invites us to do in our own lives what Mary Magdalene did in her life, to free ourselves from our own 7 demons, the fears, the prejudices, the internalized submissiveness, the inherited lies, the unexamined authorities, so that we can see, hear, speak, with the same radical freedom with which she saw, heard, and spoke. The canonical story of Mary Magdalene, as it comes to us through the 4 Gospels, ends abruptly. She appears at the crucifixion. She appears at the burial. She appears at the empty tomb. She appears in the garden, recognizing the risen Christ by the voice that pronounces her name. And then, silence. The canonical Gospels tell us nothing about what happened to her after that extraordinary morning in Jerusalem. There is no record of what she did in the following weeks, in the following months, in the following years. We do not know where she lived. We do not know how she died. We do not know where she was buried. The biblical text, so rich in details about the central moments of her life, simply abandons her trajectory after the encounter in the garden. But humanity, throughout the centuries, has not been able to come to terms with this silence, and as happens whenever a powerful figure disappears without leaving a clear biographical trace, the collective imagination began to fill in the gaps. Legends emerged. Local traditions crystallized. Entire communities began to claim the privilege of having been the final destination of that woman whose life had touched so closely the heart of the founding Christian events. The most persistent tradition, and perhaps the most beautiful of all, is the one that places the final destiny of Mary Magdalene in the south of France, in the region now known as Provence. According to this tradition, which began to develop probably in the 9th century and reached its full articulation in the 13th century, Mary Magdalene, along with a small group of companions, among them her brother Lazarus, her sister Martha, and some other women from the circle of disciples, would have fled Palestine after the first persecutions of Jesus' followers, embarked on a small boat without sails and oars, and miraculously crossed the Mediterranean to land in a small cove on the French coast, in a place that today is called, precisely in honor of this legend, Sainte Marie de la Mer, the Holy Marias of the Sea. From this landing, according to tradition, the group dispersed throughout the region. Martha would have gone to Tarascon, where she would have tamed a terrible dragon called Tarasque. Lazarus would have become the first bishop of Marseille, and Mary Magdalene, after preaching for some time in the coastal cities, would have retreated to an isolated cave in the limestone mountains of Provence, in a place now called Sainte-Baume, a word that in Old Occitan simply means holy cave. There, according to legend, she would have spent the last 30 years of her life in contemplative meditation, spiritually nourished, levitating 7 times a day in mystical ecstasy, during which she was taken by angels to the heights of heaven to receive visions of divine glory. It is a beautiful story. And it is, of course, in its literal form, a story almost certainly legendary, without verifiable historical foundation. The first centuries of Christianity in Provence are well documented by archaeology and history, and there is no reliable evidence of a direct presence of Mary Magdalene in the region. The legends began to develop very late, probably as part of the effort of local monasteries to attract pilgrims and prestige, and were codified in texts such as the Golden Legend by Jacobus de Voragine, written in the 13th century, which became the great manual of medieval hagiography, read throughout Europe as if it were pure historical truth. But, and here is the fascinating point, the fact that these legends are legendary does not mean they are less important. They are, in a sense, even more important than if they were facts, because they reveal something profound about what this figure represented for the spiritual imagination of medieval Western society. They reveal a persistent, irresistible collective need to imagine Mary Magdalene as a woman who, after the resurrection, continued her spiritual journey in a direction that progressively separated her from the institutional structures of emerging Christianity. A woman who chose the cave instead of the altar, who chose solitary contemplation instead of public preaching, who chose direct mystical ecstasy instead of ecclesiastical hierarchy. This legendary Mary Magdalene, the hermit of Saint-Baume, is, in many ways, a projection of the deeper spiritual aspirations of medieval women who found no space in the official structures of the Church, women who wanted a direct relationship with the divine without having to pass through the filter of confessing priests, administrative bishops, distant popes, women who wanted to be themselves mystics, prophetesses, spiritual teachers, and who, by venerating Mary Magdalene in her eremitic version, found a figure that validated these aspirations, that offered a model that said, yes, it is possible, a woman can reach the highest heights of spiritual experience without needing any institutional authorization for that. Spinoza, living in the 17th century, in the midst of Dutch Calvinism, would probably have looked at these medieval legends with a mix of critical skepticism and anthropological fascination. Skepticism, because he did not believe in miracles in the supernatural sense. He did not believe in sailless boats crossing the Mediterranean, did not believe in levitation 7 times a day, did not believe in purely spiritual nourishment for 30 years. For him, these stories were typical examples of what he called superstition, inventions of the human imagination, strengthened by fear and desire, repeated over generations until they became indistinguishable from reality in the eyes of the credulous. But at the same time, anthropological fascination, because Spinoza understood that these legends, although literally false, expressed deep emotional and spiritual truths. They expressed the human yearning for transcendence, the hope that there is something more than everyday life, the conviction that certain people, certain saints, certain mystics, certain figures laden with meaning, can live in a higher dimension of existence and can guide us in that direction. And these emotional and spiritual truths, according to Spinoza, deserved to be respected, even if the supernatural garments they wore had to be progressively removed by critical reason. The cave of Saint-Baume still receives pilgrims from all over the world today. Nestled in a cliff of grey limestone, hidden amidst a primeval forest that is one of the few remnants of the original Mediterranean vegetation, it is a place of imposing, almost unreal beauty. Visitors must climb a long, steep path, passing through centuries-old trees, listening to the birds singing, feeling the cool breeze blowing from the heights on their faces. When they finally reach the cave, they find inside a small chapel built into the rock itself, with altars, images, candles lit in silence. And many report, regardless of their religious convictions, regardless of whether they believe in the medieval legends or not, a feeling of presence, of peace, of something they cannot name, but that touches them deeply. This experience, from a Spinozist perspective, does not need to be explained in supernatural terms. It can be explained in purely human terms. The accumulated effect of centuries of sincere devotion in the same place, the extraordinary natural beauty of the surroundings, the inner quiet that descends upon someone who makes a long journey of purification, the collective cultural memory that imbues the place with layers and layers of symbolic meaning. All of this together is enough to produce that feeling of presence without the need to invoke miracles or levitations, and this, far from diminishing the importance of the place, enhances it, because it shows that human beings, with their capacity for devotion, imagination, and symbolic creation, are capable of transforming cold stones into living altars, anonymous caves into sanctuaries full of presence, geographical places into meeting points between the finite and the infinite. And that the memory of a woman like Mary Magdalene, nourished by centuries of collective love, can continue to generate real spiritual experiences for those who seek her, even if many of the biographical details attributed to her are late constructions of devotional imagination. The big question for us is not whether Mary Magdalene really was in Provence or not. The big question is why so many people, for so many centuries, needed to believe that she was. What this belief reveals about the spiritual aspirations of the West, and what it can teach us, even today, about our own quests. There is another theory about Mary Magdalene that, in recent decades, has gained enormous popularity through best-selling novels, Hollywood films, and endless debates on social media. It is the theory of her marriage to Jesus. According to this hypothesis, Mary Magdalene was not just a close disciple, not just the most intimate spiritual companion, not just the apostle of the apostles. She would have been literally the wife of Jesus. And in some bolder versions of this theory, she would also have been the mother of at least one child of his, founding a lineage that would have crossed the centuries and survived to this day in some European families. This theory must be taken seriously, but also with intellectual honesty. And this honesty requires recognizing, first and foremost, that there is no direct, provable, irrefutable historical evidence that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. No ancient text, canonical or Gnostic, states this unequivocally. No document from the time has survived to give us this certainty. All that exists are indirect clues, ambiguous suggestions, significant silences, and the interpretation that moderns make of these elements. The most frequently cited clue comes from the Gospel of Philip, that Nag Hammadi text we mentioned earlier, which describes Mary Magdalene as the companion of Jesus and says that he kissed her often. The Greek word koinonos, translated as companion, can indeed, in certain contexts of ancient literature, designate a wife or sexual partner. And the mention of kisses, although the exact location is lost in the manuscript's gap, suggests a physical intimacy that goes beyond what we would normally expect between a spiritual master and a disciple. Another clue comes from the observation that, in first-century Jewish culture, it was extremely rare for an adult Jewish man, especially a man with religious aspirations like Jesus, to remain single into his 30s. Marriage was considered a religious obligation, an explicit commandment of the Torah. Rabbis married, prophets married, spiritual masters married. Celibacy as a religious ideal was a rare exception, mainly associated with the Essenes, a marginal sect whose manuscripts were discovered at Qumran. So why do the canonical Gospels not mention Jesus' marriage? Proponents of the theory respond, because this information was systematically erased precisely to construct the ideal of the celibate Christ, which suited the later ecclesiastical structures. A third clue, more subtle, comes from the wedding scene at Cana, recorded in the 2nd chapter of the Gospel of John. In that scene, Jesus, his mother, and his disciples attend a wedding. At a certain moment, the wine runs out. Mary, the mother of Jesus, approaches him and says, "They have no more wine." And Jesus, although he initially hesitates, ends up performing the famous miracle of turning water into wine. Advocates of the marriage theory ask, why did Mary, the mother of Jesus, feel obligated to inform him of the problem? Why did she have the authority to expect him to resolve the situation? The suggested answer from this interpretation is that perhaps that wedding was, in fact, his own wedding, and that is why he and his mother felt responsible for ensuring that everything went well. Are these clues sufficient to generate a plausible hypothesis? For some, yes. For most academic historians, no. Most serious scholars of early Christian history consider that the available evidence is insufficient to assert with any degree of certainty that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. But they also recognize that the available evidence is insufficient to assert the opposite with any degree of certainty. In other words, the question remains open in the realm of the possible, but not of the proven. And it is precisely here that the most important contribution of Spinoza's methodology comes in. Spinoza taught us to separate three things that are often confused: what we know for certain, what we can reasonably infer, and what we merely imagine or desire. Intellectual maturity consists largely in keeping these three categories separate, without allowing desire to invade the realm of inference, and without allowing inference to invade the realm of certain knowledge. Applying this methodology to the case of the supposed marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, what can we honestly say? We can say with certainty that there existed an extraordinary closeness between them, attested by multiple texts. We can infer with reasonable plausibility that this relationship was perceived by the other disciples as exceptional and generated some type of tension within the group. We can imagine, without any direct support in the texts, that this relationship was of a conjugal nature. But we need to keep these three things separate. We must not confuse what we imagine with what we know. And here is a crucial point that is often lost in the passionate discussions surrounding this theory: the true importance of Mary Magdalene, the true radicality of her figure, the true threat she represented to the patriarchal structures of the medieval church, does not depend on whether she was or was not the wife of Jesus. Even if she was merely a disciple, even if the relationship between them was purely spiritual and fraternal, she was still what the canonical texts unambiguously say she was: the first witness of the resurrection, the apostle of the apostles, the leader of the female circle of disciples, a woman of means who supported the movement, a central and irreplaceable figure in the founding Christian narrative. And it is this importance, real and documented, that needed to be erased. It was not to hide a secret marriage that Gregory the Great transformed Mary Magdalene into a repentant prostitute. It was to neutralize a female leadership that, even without any romantic or matrimonial dimension, was too radical for the patriarchal church that was consolidating. The marriage theory, in a sense, is even a distraction. It turns the discussion about Mary Magdalene into a discussion about marital scandal, about erotic secrets, about genealogical conspiracies, when the real discussion should be about something much more serious and consequential, about the systematic silencing of female voices in the religious structures of the West, and about the cultural, political, and spiritual implications of this silencing over nearly 2 millennia. When a contemporary woman is discredited in a professional meeting, when her ideas are appropriated by male colleagues without credit, when her leadership is questioned by criteria that would never be applied to a man, she is experiencing, on a micro scale, exactly the same pattern that silenced Mary Magdalene on a macro scale. And the rediscovery of her true story is not just an academic exercise in historical revisionism. It is a political and spiritual tool to confront this pattern in our time, in our own lives. Perhaps Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. Perhaps not. We will probably never know for sure. But what we know without any doubt is that she was diminished, that her memory was distorted, that her voice was silenced, and that recovering this memory, restoring this voice, is a task that does not belong only to historians, but to all of us who inherit a culture built on the ruins of her silencing. Spinoza would say, "Examine the facts coldly, separate what you know from what you imagine, but do not use this separation as an excuse for indifference." Critical reason is not the opposite of the passion for justice. It is its sharpest instrument. Use it. There is an aspect of the figure of Mary Magdalene that deserves special attention, and that is closely linked to the way she has been represented in Western art over the centuries. The visual history of this woman is, in itself, a fascinating story. A story parallel to the textual history, but that often contradicts or complements what the texts say. Let us begin with ancient Christian art. In the early centuries, before Gregory the Great's interpretation became consolidated, Mary Magdalene was represented in a very different way from that which would become standard later. In mosaics and frescoes of the Roman catacombs, in ancient Byzantine icons, in illuminated manuscripts from the early monasteries, she appears as a dignified woman dressed in long tunics, often carrying a jar of ointment, a reference to the perfume with which she anointed Jesus' body. But without any penitential or sexual connotation, she was a solemn, respected figure, visually equated with the male apostles. In some Byzantine icons, she appears holding a red egg, a symbol of the resurrection that she was the first to announce, a tradition that still survives today in Eastern Orthodox churches, especially at Easter. This dignified representation began to change progressively from the Middle Ages onward, as Gregory the Great's version became hegemonic. The first representations of the penitent Mary Magdalene timidly emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, in illuminated manuscripts and stained glass of the great Gothic cathedrals, and it was from the Renaissance that this representation reached its full expression, becoming one of the most explored themes in European art of the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Renaissance and Baroque painters discovered, in this figure, a unique opportunity to combine religious piety with carnal sensuality. Mary Magdalene was portrayed nude or semi-nude, in contemplative poses, with long hair that only partially covered her body, in cave-like settings that suggested both spiritual penitence and erotic isolation. Painters such as Titian, Caravaggio, Georges de la Tour, Rubens, Guido Reni created absolute masterpieces with this figure as the theme. And these masterpieces, although artistically extraordinary, powerfully contributed to fix in the Western collective imagination an image of Mary Magdalene that had very little relation to the historical woman, but corresponded perfectly to the masculine fantasies of the time about penitential, sexualized, and dominated femininity. Think of Titian. His famous penitent Mary Magdalene, painted in the 1530s and existing in various versions, shows a woman with long golden hair, her bare chest only partially covered by her locks, eyes turned to the sky in mystical ecstasy, hands crossed over her heart in a gesture of devotion. It is a beautiful image, and it is a deeply ambiguous image. Penitence mixes with seduction. Spiritual devotion mixes with bodily exposure. The viewer's gaze is invited to oscillate between religious contemplation and carnal desire. This pattern repeated itself, with variations, in hundreds of paintings over the following centuries. Mary Magdalene became the most sensualized saint in Christian iconography, which is a curious irony for a woman who, according to the canonical Gospels, never had any sexual dimension in her relationship with Jesus, and who was never described as having committed any sexual sin. The invention of Gregory the Great, amplified by the imagination of painters, created a figure that had more to do with the fantasies of the European masculine imaginary than with the historical woman from Magdala. And here, again, Spinoza's perspective can help us understand what was happening. Spinoza dedicated a significant part of his ethics to the analysis of human passions, of what he called affects. For him, human beings are driven by a complex combination of affects: joy, sadness, desire, fear, hope, hatred, love. And most of these affects operate unconsciously, manipulating our decisions and perceptions without our full awareness of it. Artists, according to this analysis, are particularly sensitive to the collective effects of their time, and their works often reveal, without them realizing it, the unresolved emotional tensions of their cultures. The paintings of the penitent Mary Magdalene from the 16th and 17th centuries are, from this perspective, extraordinary documents about the tensions of the time. They reveal a culture simultaneously fascinated and terrified by female sexuality, a culture that needed to domesticate this sexuality, contain it, subject it to a narrative of sin and repentance, but that at the same time could not resist its appeal, its power, its beauty. The figure of the penitent Magdalene allowed for an imaginary resolution of this tension. The sensual woman appeared, but she appeared defeated, repentant, submissive, in religious ecstasy that neutralized her dangerous carnal autonomy. It was a way to have the cake and eat it too, to visually enjoy female beauty without having to recognize its autonomous dignity. These paintings, while documenting the tensions of their time, actively contributed to reproducing them. Generation after generation of European viewers learned by contemplating these works a certain way of looking at women, a way that combined desire and judgment, attraction and contempt, fascination, and the need for control. And this visual pedagogy, sustained by centuries of artistic production, left deep marks on Western sensibility, marks that in many ways still condition the way we look at women, especially those who dare to publicly manifest their sexuality, their autonomy, their power. But the history of art about Mary Magdalene is not just the story of this problematic sensualization. There are also other currents, other representations, other possibilities. There was, for example, the tradition of the preaching Mary Magdalene, especially strong in medieval Provençal art, which showed her standing, dressed simply, speaking to attentive crowds, a representation that preserved the memory of her apostolic role, of her spiritual authority, of her function as a messenger. There was the tradition of the reading Mary Magdalene, frequent in the illuminated manuscripts of female monasteries, which showed her sitting with a book in her hands, a symbol of wisdom and study, a figure that served as a model for educated nuns who copied and illuminated those manuscripts. There was the tradition of Mary Magdalene in the garden, revisiting the evangelical scene of the encounter with the risen Christ, which showed her in a moment of pure spiritual intimacy without any penitential connotation. And in the 20th century, with the impact of the Nag Hammadi discoveries and the growth of feminist movements inside and outside the churches, new representations of Mary Magdalene began to emerge. Contemporary women artists, especially, have created works that attempt to recover the original dignity of this figure, paintings, sculptures, installations, performances that show her as an apostle, as a teacher, as a spiritual leader, as a whole woman instead of a sexualized fragment. These works, in critical dialogue with the Western iconographic tradition, propose a new way of seeing Mary Magdalene, and through her, a new way of seeing spiritual femininity in general. The history of art about this figure is, therefore, a microsynthesis of the broader history of the relationship between Western cultures and femininity. And observing this history attentively, with the analytical coldness that Spinoza recommended, is an exercise in collective self-knowledge. It is to realize how the images we inherit shape our perception without our awareness of it. It is to learn to look critically at what seemed natural and to discover behind the apparent naturalness choices, interests, ideologies. It is ultimately to take a step towards that inner freedom which, for Spinoza, is the supreme goal of human existence, the freedom to see things as they really are, instead of how we were told they are. The figure of Mary Magdalene, examined in light of Spinoza's thought and the critical history of Christianity, opens a window for a much broader reflection, a reflection on the sacred feminine in comparative religions, on the universal structures of silencing female voices, and on the contemporary possibilities of recovering those voices. This reflection, although it has as its starting point the specific case of a woman from the 1st century in Galilee, connects with phenomena that appear in practically all spiritual traditions of humanity. In almost all ancient religions, before the consolidation of the great patriarchal monotheisms, the sacred was imagined in both masculine and feminine terms. There were gods and there were goddesses. There were priests and there were priestesses. There were prophets and there were prophetesses. There were male spiritual masters and there were female spiritual teachers. The great cultures of the ancient Near East, Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Canaanite, venerated divine pantheons in which female figures such as Inanna, Ishtar, Isis, Astarte occupied positions of immense power and dignity. They were not secondary, complementary, decorative figures. They were central deities, as powerful as their male counterparts, often older, more primordial, more deeply connected to the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth. With the rise of monotheisms, especially biblical Judaism in its most consolidated form, and later institutional Christianity and Islam, this plurality of the sacred was progressively reduced. Goddesses were demonized, turned into pagan idols to be fought against. Priestesses were excluded from the new exclusively male cults. Prophetesses were silenced or had their memories erased. And the divine, in the collective Western imagination, came to be thought of as predominantly, almost exclusively masculine. But this reduction has never been complete. In all monotheistic traditions, there have always been minority currents, often mystical, that have refused to accept this total masculinization of the divine. In Judaism, there is the tradition of Shekinah, the feminine presence of God in the world, which developed especially in medieval Kabbalah, with figures like Isaac Luria. In Islam, there is the Sufi tradition, with extraordinary female mystics like Rabia of Basra in the 8th century, who dared to preach a love for God so pure that it dispensed with any reward or fear of punishment. And in Christianity, alongside the institutionalized figure of the Virgin Mary, there has always existed the more subterranean, more subversive, more laden with transformative potential figure of Mary Magdalene. This persistence of sacred feminine figures, even in the most patriarchal traditions, suggests something important. It suggests that there is, in the human psyche, a deep, perhaps insuppressible need to imagine the divine in terms that include the feminine. When this need is frustrated by the official structures of a religion, it finds other avenues of expression. It appears in popular devotions, in marginal mystical traditions, in folk songs, in fairy tales, in pilgrimages to shrines of obscure feminine figures. It cannot be eliminated. It always reappears in one form or another, demanding to be recognized. Spinoza, although he did not write directly about the sacred feminine, offers through his philosophy a basis for understanding this persistence. For him, the divine substance is absolutely infinite and contains within itself all qualities, all attributes, all possible forms of manifestation. Reducing the divine to a single set of attributes, only masculine, only active, only rational, only transcendent, is to commit a fundamental philosophical error, to take a part for the whole, to confuse one of the faces of the infinite with the infinite itself. The nature of ultimate reality, according to Spinoza, requires us to think in plural, encompassing terms, capable of including seemingly opposing polarities in a deeper synthesis. This philosophical view converges impressively with what many mystical traditions, including currents of Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic Sufism, medieval Christian mysticism, and various Eastern traditions such as Hindu Tantra and Chinese Taoism, have always affirmed. In all these traditions, the divine is understood as a reality that transcends gender polarities, but that manifests in the world through an eternal dance between the masculine and the feminine, between the active and the receptive, between the solar and the lunar, between yang and yin. And the task of the human being seeking spiritual enlightenment is, in part, to integrate within themselves these two dimensions, reclaiming what unilateral culture may have repressed. When we apply this perspective to the case of Mary Magdalene, we perceive something fascinating. She emerges in the spiritual history of the West as a figure that carries, in a concentrated way, exactly this integrative principle. She is the disciple who understands what others do not understand. She is the woman who challenges male authority without needing to deny respect for it. She is the feminine presence that complements, without competing, with the central masculine presence of Jesus. She is, in a certain sense, the embodied Sophia, the divine wisdom that manifests through a human feminine form, offering nascent Christianity the possibility of complete spiritual integration, and this possibility, unfortunately, was rejected. Institutional Christianity chose the path of male unilaterality, eliminating or marginalizing all figures and currents that offered alternatives. The result, over 2,000 years, has been a deeply unbalanced Western culture, marked by a violent division between reason and intuition, between spirit and matter, between transcendence and immanence, between domination and care, between conquest and preservation. This division, which is at the root of many of the crises of our time, ecological crisis, gender relations crisis, mental health crisis, spirituality crisis, is, in part, the result of this ancient rejection of the integrative feminine principle. Recovering the figure of Mary Magdalene, in our time, is not just a matter of historical justice for a woman silenced 2,000 years ago. It is also a matter of cultural and spiritual survival. We urgently need to relearn to integrate what has been separated for centuries. We need to return to imagining the sacred in terms that include all dimensions of human experience, not just some of them. We need to heal within ourselves and within our cultures the founding violence that has split us into incomplete halves, always at war with one another. Mary Magdalene, in this sense, is more than a historical figure. She is an archetype. She is a symbol of that part of each of us, men and women, that has been repressed by dominant cultural structures and that needs to be reclaimed so that we can live fuller, deeper, truer lives. When you reconnect with your own capacity for deep intuition, you are reconnecting with what she represents. When you dare to trust your inner experience against the external authorities that seek to invalidate it, You are walking her path. When you stand up in a room full of skeptical men and speak with the calm clarity of someone who knows what they have seen, you are continuing her work. Spinoza taught us that true freedom is not the absence of determinations. That is an illusion. True freedom is the deep understanding of the determinations that constitute us, and the ability to act from our own essential center rather than from external pressures that alienate us. And this inner freedom, this power to be who we truly are, is what figures like Mary Magdalene invite us to reclaim. Block 13. We have reached the point in our journey where we need to ask, with all honesty, what does all this mean for you now, at this very moment in your life? Not for the theology student, not for the historian of antiquity, not for the professional philosopher poring over Spinoza's texts in university libraries. For you, the concrete person who is following this narrative, who has heard all these words, who has allowed themselves to be led by this investigation that began in a fishing village in Galilee 2,000 years ago and has brought us here. Because philosophy, according to Spinoza, is not an abstract exercise. It is not a game of concepts to be played in air-conditioned classrooms. It is an art of living. It is a medicine for the soul. It is a practical path of inner transformation, which begins the moment we decide to look at our own existence with the same analytical coldness and the same lucid compassion with which we would look at any other phenomenon in the universe. And the case of Mary Magdalene, examined in all its breadth, offers practical lessons for this art of living, lessons that go far beyond any academic interest. The first lesson, and perhaps the most important, has to do with the recognition of the narratives we inherit. Each of us, without exception, grows up immersed in narratives. Religious narratives, family narratives, cultural narratives, national narratives, professional narratives. These narratives tell us who we are, where we come from, where we are going, what is right and wrong, what we should value and what we should despise, who deserves respect and who deserves contempt. They form the air we breathe, so present that they become invisible. And most of the time, we live our entire lives without ever seriously questioning them, accepting them as if they were reality itself rather than specific interpretations of that reality. The case of Mary Magdalene teaches us, with brutal clarity, that these narratives can be profoundly wrong, that things we learned as absolute truths may have originated in a single papal homily pronounced by a single man on a single morning 14 centuries ago. That figures presented to us in one way may have in reality been completely different. And if this is true for such a central figure in the Christian tradition, it is reasonable to assume that it is also true for many other things we have learned without questioning, about our family, about our culture, about our profession, about ourselves. The first step to freedom, according to Spinoza, is exactly this: to recognize that we live immersed in narratives, and that these narratives are not neutral, are not natural, are not inevitable. They are constructions, with authors, with interests, with history, and that only when we begin to perceive their constructed nature can we begin to judge them critically, to question their premises, to identify their effects, to decide which of them we want to keep and which we want to discard. The second lesson has to do with the role of institutions in shaping these narratives. Institutions, religious, political, educational, media, are not neutral entities that merely transmit information. They have their own interests, their own dynamics, their own logics of self-preservation and expansion. And these dynamics often determine what is said and what is silenced, what is exalted and what is erased, who is remembered and who is forgotten. The case of Mary Magdalene exemplifies this. The medieval church did not silence her memory out of individual malice from some priest. It silenced it out of institutional necessity, because her memory threatened the power structure that was being built, because her presence in the founding narrative opened possibilities for female leadership, for direct spirituality, for charismatic authority against the institutional that needed to be closed for the clerical edifice to rise. This lesson is absolutely current. The institutions of our time continue to operate according to similar logics. The media highlight certain voices and silence others. according to criteria that are rarely made explicit. Universities form consensuses about what is legitimate knowledge and what is marginal speculation. Companies build narratives about themselves that omit inconvenient aspects of their actual performance. Governments tell national stories that exalt certain episodes and suppress others. And we, citizens, consumers, believers, voters, often swallow these narratives without realizing how much they are shaping our perception of reality. Spinoza proposed against this situation the constant exercise of what he called reason. Not the cold, calculating reason of common caricatures, but a reason integrated with sensitivity, with intuition, with a passion for truth, a reason that examines, compares, contextualizes, suspects appearances, seeks the real causes behind visible effects. This reason is a tool of defense against institutional manipulation. Those who learn to use it become progressively harder to deceive, more capable of discerning between what is said and what is being hidden, more autonomous in their judgments. The third lesson, perhaps the deepest of all, has to do with what to do with the silenced voices we discover, when we begin to perceive, in our own case, which voices have been muffled within us throughout life, which aspects of our personality have been repressed to fit into certain molds, which talents have been discouraged, which aspirations have been ridiculed, which intuitions have been invalidated. An immense task arises, the task of recovering these voices, of giving them voice again, of integrating them back into the totality of our being. This task is exactly analogous, on an individual scale, to the collective work of historical recovery we are doing in relation to figures like Mary Magdalene. Each of us has within us a silenced Mary Magdalene. It may be the curious child who was silenced by impatient adults. It may be the sensitive teenager who was forced to become tough to survive in school. It may be the autonomous woman who was discouraged from competing with men in professional arenas. It may be the tender man who was convinced that tenderness is weakness. It may be the artist, the mystic, the philosopher, the activist, who were convinced that those vocations were immature and that it was necessary to be realistic and follow more conventional paths. Recognizing these silenced voices, lamenting the violence they suffered, and initiating the slow and patient work of giving them space within our existence, this is, according to Spinoza, an essential part of what he called beatitude, not as a fleeting emotional state, but as a lasting condition of inner coherence, in which we live more and more from our true essence and less from the external pressures that alienate us from ourselves. And this inner restoration has collective implications. When we recover within ourselves the silenced dimensions, we become more capable of recognizing and supporting the silenced voices in the world around us. We become more sensitive to invisible injustices. We become more inclined to give space to those who have been excluded, to listen to those who have not been heard, to value those who have been devalued. Inner transformation and social transformation, according to this view, are two sides of the same process. Mary Magdalene today visits us not as a distant figure from a dead past, but as a living presence that invites us to this dual transformation. She invites us to look within and perceive what we have silenced. She invites us to look outward and perceive what our culture has silenced. And she invites us to begin with patience and courage the work of giving voice to these voices, starting with ourselves and progressively extending to the world around us. This work is not easy. It is not quick. It does not bring immediate rewards. But it is, according to the wisdom we inherit from both Mary Magdalene and Spinoza, the only work that truly matters, because it is the work of becoming fully human, of realizing in our concrete existence that fullness that is latent in our essence, of living finally as free beings in a universe that, although seemingly indifferent, contains within it all the possibilities of beauty, wisdom, and love that we can imagine, and many others that we have not yet even begun to suspect. We conclude this long journey with a final reflection that attempts to tie together all the threads we have traversed together. We began on a foggy morning in Amsterdam, with a 23-year-old being excommunicated by his own community. We crossed seas and centuries to arrive at a fishing village in Galilee, where a woman named Miriam of Magdala lived a life that would change the world. We followed her presence at the crucifixion, at the burial, at the encounter with the risen Christ in the garden. We saw her name being progressively erased by the institutional structures that needed to silence her. We witnessed the surgical operation performed by Gregory the Great in 591, which transformed her from apostle to prostitute. We descended into the catacombs and into the caves of the Egyptian desert to rescue the manuscripts that had remained hidden for over 1,500 years. We saw how her image was distorted by Western art, while her memory stubbornly resisted, always finding new channels of expression. And we reflected on what all this means for us now, in this troubled time in which we find ourselves living. The question that remains at the end of this journey is the following: what should we do with what we have learned? The first thing, perhaps the simplest, is to never again passively accept the official narratives presented to us, in any area of life. In religion, in politics, in science, in art, in history, in economics, in education, in any field, not as an attitude of permanent cynicism, which is as sterile as naive credulity, but as an exercise of active discernment, always willing to ask, who is telling this story? With what interests? With what omissions? With what effects? This question, asked regularly and without fear, is the best protection we have against manipulation. It is the most precious inheritance Spinoza left us. It is the practical application of what he called love for truth. The second thing is to begin, on a small scale, to participate in the work of recovering silenced voices, in our family, in our community, in our professional environment, to seek to know the stories that have not been told to us, to look for the figures who have been excluded from official manuals, to listen to the testimonies of those whose experience has been systematically discredited, not only with intellectual curiosity, but with that deep attitude of repair that recognizes, in each silenced story, a debt of civilization that needs to be paid, to the extent of our concrete possibilities. The third thing, and the most difficult, is to do this work within ourselves, to identify the voices that have been silenced in our own existence, to lament the violence they suffered, to initiate the patient process of giving them space, giving them voice, giving them legitimacy. This inner work is, according to Spinoza's wisdom, the foundation of all genuine collective transformation. No one liberates others if they have not first liberated themselves. No one recovers the silenced voices in the world if they have not first recovered the silenced voices within themselves. The fourth thing is to cultivate, in a world dominated by speed, noise, and distraction, the contemplative capacity that figures like Mary Magdalene and Spinoza, each in their own way, embodied with such intensity. The capacity to stop, to listen, to pay attention to what is subtly happening inside and outside of us, to resist the temptation to have instant opinions about everything, and to cultivate instead the patience of one who waits for the truth to reveal itself in its own time. This contemplative capacity is not a luxury for the idle. It is a fundamental necessity for those who want to live deeply. And it is, perhaps, the greatest antidote we have against the annihilating superficiality of our time. And finally, the fifth thing, which in a way encompasses all the previous ones, to cultivate a relationship with the sacred that does not depend on institutions, mediations, or external authorities. A direct, personal, living relationship. A relationship that recognizes that the divine, however you conceive or name it, or even if you prefer not to use that word, is accessible to you here and now in your own inner experience, that no intermediaries are necessary, that there are no mandatory gatekeepers, that every human soul has within it the power to relate to the totality of the real without needing to ask anyone for permission to do so. This direct relationship with the sacred is ultimately what both Mary Magdalene and Spinoza, spanning the centuries that separate them, came to teach us. It is the essence of the encounter in the garden, where the risen Christ calls Mary by name and she recognizes him immediately, without needing any intermediary. It is the essence of the intellectual love of God that Spinoza described as the highest point of human experience, and it is available to you now, on the other side of this screen, at this very moment, if you have the courage to seek it, not in books, not in sermons, not in rituals, but in the inner silence where your own essence reveals itself to itself, in the moment of pure presence when you simply are, without masks, without roles, without obligations, without judgments. That moment is the portal. That moment is the garden. That moment is the cave of Saint Baume. That moment is the lens-polishing workshop in Amsterdam. That moment is everything. And it is here now, waiting for you to recognize it. Mary Magdalene, 2,000 years later, still runs through the streets of Jerusalem with the news. She still pronounces, with a voice choked with emotion, the words that would change the world. She still faces the incredulity of the men who accuse her of delirium. She still remains firm, patient, lucid, loving, waiting for someone to finally hear her with the open ears of the heart. Baruch Spinoza, 3.5 centuries after his excommunication, still polishes his lenses in his small Dutch workshop. He still writes in small, precise letters the geometric propositions of his ethics. He still offers us, with the serenity of one who has nothing to lose and nothing to fear, the priceless gift of free thought, capable of illuminating all the dark zones of human existence. And you, reader, spectator, journey companion, you are there, receiving this inheritance, carrying these 2,000 years of silenced history and this philosophical light that has crossed the centuries, carrying the responsibility now to do something with all this, to live in a way that honors this inheritance, to think with more courage, to speak with more truth, to act with more compassion, to love with more depth. It is no small task. But, as Spinoza would say in the aphorism that concludes his masterpiece, all excellent things are as difficult as they are rare. Excellence is not easy. Freedom is not easy. Truth is not easy. But it is there waiting, eternally available to those who dare to seek it. Mary of Magdala dared. Baruch of Spinoza dared. Now, it is your turn. May this story, which we have traversed together during these hours, be etched in some corner of your being. May it continue to resonate within you in the coming weeks, in the coming months, in the coming years. May it transform in your concrete life into concrete actions, small and large, that contribute in your own way to the long collective work of making this world a place where no voice needs to be silenced for others to be heard. This is the final invitation. This is the testament of this journey. This is the inheritance that Mary Magdalene and Baruch Spinoza leave us, crossing the centuries together, holding hands across the differences of time, culture, gender, tradition, and offering us, you and me, a light that has never gone out, and that will never go out, as long as there are human hearts willing to receive it. Thank you for walking this far. The journey ends. Life continues, and all that we have learned in these shared moments now belongs to you.